afternoon, good evening. Hi, everybody.
Good evening, everyone.
Are we ready? We have a lively group tonight. Everybody's very excited.
We're on fire.
So today actually marks a bit of a grim milestone. I don't know if anyone heard about this, but this is Donald Trump's 1,000th day in office.
Yes.
So if you ever wonder what 1,000 days feels like, just think of this. It's been quite a ride, hasn't it?
It only feels like 2,000.
Yeah.
What's that?
More like
Indivisible Sacramento has been around for about 996 days now. We started on January 24th that year. So the good news is there are only 461 days left because we're going to do everything we can to get them out of there next year, if not before.
Yeah.
Right? Because since we met last, I think it happened just a couple days after our last meeting, the House Dems have finally opened an impeachment investigation into the president. It took them 9 months after we, worked so hard to elect him, but they did it. So it's really encouraging, and honestly, it just felt like such a relief that day that this finally happened. Everything, all the news just piled up all at once. It just felt like a relief more than anything else. I don't know how everyone else felt, but man, that was nice. So I always like to start out by asking, is anyone who's here for the first time today that wants to say hello? Are we all repeat offenders? All right, well, welcome back, everybody. It is good to see you, but I talk about the impeachment inquiry that happened in large part because of the efforts of people like us and people all across America and indivisible groups. We called our members of Congress so many times, even the ones who were inclined to agree with us. The fact that they're tallying these calls, these demands for impeachment investigation, they take note of those calls and they report to their leadership and let them know what they're hearing. So it's crucial that we keep doing that, keep calling our representatives, letting them know what we think, and keep doing that. So really, we should appreciate what we've done there, what we still have to do with the impeachment inquiry. But we have more work to do than just that. We all know we're going to need to do a lot next year. We're going to need to be helping with elections, with turning out voters, with making phone calls. And Indivisible Sacramento could actually use some volunteers here. Ellen's going to come up and talk about some opportunities we've got. We figure we'll do this right at the beginning so that everybody's still alert instead of at the end when everyone's trying to get out of here. So let's hear about what we need to do.
Okay, so
Maybe the side.
mine isn't totally exhaustive. Nate will have a few other things to talk about, but so we're always trying to get people to do two big things. One is canvass, and the other is write postcards, in addition to meeting with your members and calling and that sort of thing. So our old friends at Callaway are doing a canvassing. There are canvasses available going on now in District 21 and 10, but the one that we're closest to is Callaway is working in District 4. Their hope is to get rid of Tom McClintock. And so we have decided on December 8th, there's two upcoming canvasses going on, November 3rd and December 8th, and these are in El Dorado County. And on our website, you can find how to sign up. But there's also this little green flyer in the back that if you're interested in this, you can pick it up. But on December 8th, we have adopted it as another Indivisible Sacramento canvassing day. So we are sort of promising them that we're going to have people come. So we're hoping that you try to find a way to get out there and do some canvassing with us, either on the 3rd, but especially on the 8th. It's an easy kind of canvas. You're not telling them who to vote for or anything. It's just going door to door to Democrats and some no party preference voters who lean left, and just reminding them that we have these elections coming up. Our primary has been moved up to March, and also El Dorado County is for the first time doing the voting centers. It's a switch over for them, so we're trying to give them information. and get them to sign a postcard saying, yeah, I talked to this person, I know there's an election, there's these 2 elections, I gotta vote. And then we mail those back to them as a reminder before the primary, and then another set before the general. So it's a pretty easy ask. You're not having to sell anybody. Many of you have already done canvassing with them. So anyway, there's 2 key dates coming up. So pick up one of these green flyers for that.
And will people thank you when you knock on their door?
They totally thank you, because they're like in El Dorado County where they think there are no other Democrats. And they're like, honey, the Democrats are here. So it's not a bad way to canvass. I hate canvassing. It's so hard, and I even do this. So anyway. And then the other thing we're doing, there are many postcard campaigns going on. Of course, there's a lot going on in Virginia, and we're trying to flip state legislatures. And those are all super important. And in addition to that, Invisible Sacramento is also running a campaign that's a little harder to explain. So I just want to take a couple of minutes to get people. So we have designed this lovely postcard aimed at young female voters in District 50. Now, you may think, District 50, isn't that Duncan Hunter's district, the guy who's indicted in blood red San Diego County? Yes, it is. And the reason that we have decided to pick this for our primary campaign, we're going to write somewhere else for the general. But prior to the primary, we're trying to get out postcards to registered Democrats, young women, who have never voted in a primary before. And the reason that we want to do that is because Duncan Hunter, who is the incumbent, has been indicted for campaign finance and other crimes and is probably going to drop out. And some big hitter Republicans have already declared, including the evil Daryl Issa. Because we have the top 2 primary system, there is some concern that we could end up with 2 Republicans at the top of the ticket for that congressional race, which we don't want. It's highly unlikely a Democrat would win this race ultimately, but to have 2 Republicans at the top of the ticket depresses Democratic turnout overall and is just a bad turnout. So our goal, the win for us here, is that the Democrat gets on the ticket, the general election ticket. So we have designed these lovely postcards, and what kind of thing do they say on the back, Cheryl?
Dear Ellen, America needs you. Come be a voter in the March 3rd primary election. You'll choose the best candidates for a win in November.
There you go.
I mean, thank you.
All right, great. So twice a month we are holding postcard parties. We have committed, and when I say committed, I mean we've already printed up 6,000 postcards to send into this district. So if you are interested in getting more information, our next one is next week, October 23rd. They are all held at the Methodist Church downtown on 21st. And they're all at 7 o'clock, and most of them are on Wednesday nights, but twice a month. Anyway, this lovely flyer, which is also in the back, spells out why we're doing this, who we're targeting, why we picked this district, where, when and where to meet, all relevant information. We're a little behind. We've been doing this for a couple of months, and we're a little behind our projected, numbers. So
and there's plenty of parking.
There's plenty of parking, and the folks at United Methodist are so nice.
And
Very nice restaurants nearby too.
Nice restaurant.
there's very little space to write, so they're quick.
They're very quick, right? So we're hoping that you show up and help us with that. So thank you, Nick.
Just in case anyone needs any further incentive or reminders about how bad Daryl Issa is, he was actually arrested twice for stealing cars, and he once owned a factory, and it was never proven, but the factory burned down under very suspicious circumstances, and he, a week after he quintupled his fire insurance. This is all on his Wikipedia page. It's and somehow he got elected to Congress after this and became a thorn in our side for decades.
He was also the richest member of Congress.
That's
so
right.
He
So
self-funded his campaign.
when you are incredibly wealthy and white and a Republican, you can steal all the cars you want and still get elected. So
And
let's
burn down a factory.
and burn down factories. So let's make sure that he doesn't get back there. Okay, we got rid of him last time. Let's just keep him out.
He made his money in alarms.
Yeah, that's right, car alarm. So every time you hear an annoying car alarm too, that's his fault.
Come around.
Yeah, that's right. He did. It's just everything you hear about the guy is worse than the last thing. So we need volunteers. Please show up for the postcards. We could really use your help, and everybody loves postcards. We have a couple of other fun things that we could actually use a little bit of help with. First of all, we've been approached by somebody who has offered to let us use their house to do a fundraiser, some sort of fundraiser, toward the election, winning the greater election, not necessarily for a specific candidate, but for some sort of cause. And we're thinking we're probably going to do this sometime next year, but we could use a little help with the organizing. If there's someone who's got some time or thinks you could help with event planning, please let us know. Is there any one person that they should stop by or maybe see? If you're interested.
Depends on when.
Okay, great.
It has to be after the remodel.
Well, they could talk to you or Haru or me, any of us.
Any of us up at the front here, please come stop by and see us afterward. It would be really appreciated. We could use some help with the event planning. And then another event we'd like to plan. A couple weeks ago, we heard from the folks from Swing Left, and they have been organizing some trips to Arizona, and I think we really need to go there at least a couple times next year. Arizona's got a Senate race, Martha McSally, that's very vulnerable. They are basically a purple state at the presidential level, plus they have a state legislature that's only about 2 or 3 seats in each chamber from flipping, and a key state for redistricting next year. So we really need to do everything we can to help our friends in Arizona, and we could use someone who is willing to be a point person to work with Swing Left and help organize a trip to Arizona.
What
Basically,
time of the year would this be?
we're thinking middle of July. No, if we could do something in the winter to organize before the primaries, winter or spring maybe, and then maybe something in the fall right before the election, I think that would be ideal. I really don't think we should go to the desert when it's 120 degrees, but unless you like that kind of thing, then maybe. So if there's someone who's interested in helping out with putting some information together and helping with organizing a trip to Arizona, then please come see us. And I do want to make one more acknowledgement before we get to our featured speaker tonight. We are joined by Danessa Atiles, who is one of the founders of the Outgrowth Indivisible group, but more importantly, she is now, what is your official title, Danessa?
I am the Senior Regional Organizer for the West Coast. I cover Northern California, Alaska, and Hawaii for Indivisible.
Oh, wow.
She actually works for Indivisible, so we are joined by an Indivisible celebrity here. Okay. And with that, I will introduce our featured speaker. He is one of our most popular guests from last year. Actually, he came and spoke to us before, and everybody seemed really interested in what he had to say. He is a freelance author and a journalist, and he has been published in many publications, including, I think, The Atlantic, The Nation, and many others. I don't have the list right in front of me. Please welcome Sasha Abramsky.
All right. Well, first of all, thank you all for inviting me back here again. And I can't honestly remember what I talked about last time, so I hope I'm not second-guessing myself. Part of the problem with a news cycle like the one we're living through at the moment is it makes it almost impossible to plan a speech in advance. Which means that I've been spending much of today trying to work out how to sort of ad-lib my way through the next half an hour. So, here goes. I don't need to tell you, because everybody in the universe knows it at this point, that we're in the middle of an impeachment inquiry. And that's a good thing. It's a good thing for all kinds of reasons. But the reason for the impeachment inquiry is actually fairly narrow. The reason for the impeachment inquiry is that Donald Trump got caught, pretty much red-handed, illegally soliciting a foreign leader to provide election year help for him by digging up dirt against a political rival. And that breaks all kinds of rules. It breaks campaign finance rules. It breaks constitutional clauses saying you can't finagle foreign governments to intervene in domestic politics. And it puts Trump in this extraordinarily vulnerable position where it's fairly certain that the House will impeach him. And this will be only the third time in American history that a president has been impeached. You had Andrew Johnson. Richard Nixon was not impeached. He chose to resign beforehand. And then you had Bill Clinton, who was impeached, but on an issue that the public never got on board with. So this is only really the second or third time that there's going to be an impeachment inquiry that the public is fully on board with, and if the opinion polls, including Fox News, are to be believed, a majority now supports. So that's the sort of pragmatic news of the day. But beyond the fact that Trump happened to be caught red-handed on this single phone call, there's actually a moral reason for impeachment and a moral reason for removal from office that goes far beyond one single rancid telephone call. And the reason for that impeachment necessity is the increasingly sadistic, cruel, irrational, bullying behavior, not just of Donald Trump, but of the entire administration that he presides over. And this is particularly the case, though not exclusively the case, vis-a-vis immigrants. When Trump came into office, a lot of my friends said, well, he actually doesn't care about anything except for money. And I'd done a lot of reporting in the caucuses and the primaries and the general election, and it seemed to me that the one thing that Trump actually did care about, in addition to money, was white nationalism. He was a dyed-in-the-wool white nationalist. He was a man who could not help himself. If there was a racist comment to be made, he would find a way to make it. If there was a racial alliance to be made with the most unsavory white nationalist characters, he'd find a way to make that alliance or to find a way not to disavow that alliance. And you've seen this now for 3 awful years throughout his presidency, that every single immigrant group that he can go after, he does go after. And that goes for whether we're talking about DACA and the hundreds of thousands of young Americans who are now vulnerable to deportation if the Supreme Court sides with Trump on DACA. It goes for temporary protected status and the hundreds of thousands of people who were here legally under temporary protected status and who Trump has tried to deport. And he hasn't succeeded yet, only because the courts have intervened. It goes for refugees. Year in, year out, he slashed the number of people admitted, down from 110,000 as a projected target in 2017 to 18,000 next year as a cap. He has demonized asylum seekers and bottled them up in awful camps south of the border, or made them live for weeks on end in tents, in puddles, along the entry bridges that connect Mexico and the United States. He has set HUD to work to find a methodology to evict 100,000 people, including 55,000 citizen children who are members of mixed status families. He has tried, and the courts last week resisted him again on this, but he has tried to dramatically rewrite American immigration policy, not through congressional legislation, but through public charge. And for those of you who don't know what public charge does, he's basically expanded the definition of who is likely to be a ward of the state and therefore eligible either for deportation or denial of entry to include anybody who uses not just cash public assistance, but food stamps, Medicaid, housing assistance, and an array of other basic parts of the safety net. Most recently, by proclamation. Didn't think we had proclamations in a democracy, but apparently we do. Hear me, oh hear me. By royal proclamation, Trump declared last week that any immigrant who could not prove they would have private health insurance within a month of arrival would be deported if they were already here or denied entry if they were trying to come in. Now, this is the same man who has spent the last 3 years trying to overturn the Affordable Care Act that mandates that Americans have health coverage. But apparently there's one rule for immigrants and another rule for poor Americans. So all of these reasons should, in and of themselves, be cause to remove this man from office. Because he has made no effort to create a government that speaks for the people. He has made an effort to create and implement governance for a narrow sliver of white nationalists within this country. And if anyone's in any doubt as to the venom behind this man's thinking, one only needs to read reports, and there are a lot of reports starting to come out because everybody is now deciding to talk to the press. One only needs to read reports about the meeting that he had with Kirstjen Nielsen, who was then the Department of Homeland Security Secretary, and other top border officials last March, in which he first of all berated his Homeland Security staff and urged them to allow immigrants to be shot in the legs, either by the army or by Border Patrol, then urged them to do a cost analysis of how they could create an impaling mechanism on top of his wall so that if people climbed the wall they would be impaled, and finally asked his staff why he couldn't have a moat filled with alligators to eat immigrants. Now, in a rational world, if you were the Secretary for Homeland Security and you heard your Commander-in-Chief say, I want a 2,000-mile-long alligator moat, you would probably alert everybody you could that we needed to implement the 25th Amendment. In our world, according to the New York Times, his officials promptly costed it out to see if it was feasible. Which I think in and of itself says how degraded governance has become in the Trump era. But let's briefly go beyond immigration. Other reasons that Trump has no business being near power. For the last 3 years, out of an obsessive, a compulsive need to dismantle anything and everything that Obama created, he has tried to dismantle the Affordable Care Act. And right now, the Department of Justice is siding with this Hail Mary lawsuit designed to render the entire thing unconstitutional, with no alternatives in place in case the Supreme Court actually does render it unconstitutional. Imagine that. To spite the previous president, he's willing to go out on a limb to try to get the Supreme Court to dismantle an insurance infrastructure that is keeping tens of millions of people with affordable health insurance. And he's willing to do it with no backstop in place. It would create economic and social and healthcare mayhem if that lawsuit succeeds. Moving on from there, he has taken an environmental wrecking ball to environmental policy, to workplace safety regulations, to banking structures, to consumer protection institutions, and he has done so again, by and large, simply to erase the legacy of his predecessor. There's no strategic thinking other than a vaguely Republican idea that regulations as a sort of be-all are bad. But more to the point, he has just decided that if he can eradicate any institution created during the Obama years or any regulation put in place during the Obama years, he will. Even if it makes people sicker, even if it makes communities dirtier, even if it makes millions of people more likely to go into bankruptcy if they develop a sickness. He has used the Department of Justice and the Environmental Protection Agency, among other agencies, as political weapons to go after his enemies. And we saw that most recently with letters sent to cities in California and to the state of California itself over homelessness. Now, homelessness is awful. You just need to walk down the street in Sacramento. We know it's a huge problem. Nobody in California is sitting there saying, we love having 100,000 people living on the streets. We think it's really good that we have tent encampments under every overpass. Nobody's saying that. What we're saying is we need money. We need resources. We need help here. We need more access to drug treatment services. We need more mental health systems. We need more affordable housing. We need more public housing. Now, some of that can be delivered at the city or the state level. But an awful lot of that takes federal effort and federal intervention, even for a state as big and as wealthy and as dynamic as California. Trump came to California. He didn't have any solutions to actually deal with the homelessness crisis. He just sent out a few tweets basically promising roundups of the homeless population. Not to help the homeless, but because they were quote-unquote nuisances and eyesores to the business community. Now, in normal circumstances, again, this kind of lack of empathy, this kind of systemic cruelty, the irrationality, all of it would be cause to give people serious doubt as to whether this man has the temperament, the capability to stay in office. But Trump's surrounded by a cult of the personality. It's an extraordinarily destructive cult of the personality. He said during the election, I could go onto Fifth Avenue, I could shoot someone in public, my supporters would still stay with me. We kind of thought he was hyperbolic at the time. This is not really hyperbolic. Basically, he has degraded and destroyed and corroded, he has bullied and he has blustered, he's insulted and he's humiliated, and the cult of the personality for 3 years has stayed intact. But here's the thing, coming back to the beginning, to the whole impeachment inquiry. Over the last 3 weeks, that cult has started to break down. And I've always thought, and I sort of feel this partly because my grandparents in the 1950s in England were deeply committed to Stalinism, to their horror afterwards. Once that cult of the personality broke down in the mid-1950s, my grandparents spent the rest of their lives second-guessing themselves about how they could have possibly bought into something as horrific as the Stalin cult of the personality. And all of their friends in the Communist Party who left felt the same thing. And I've always thought that when cults of the personality break, they break spectacularly. They don't gradually diminish, but something happens, whether it's Hungary in 1956 or whether it's what we're seeing today. And when that cult of the personality breaks down, it splinters into a million pieces and can never be resurrected. And I think we're starting to see that with the impeachment inquiry. The first thing that's happened is the culture of impunity is gone. All of those career professionals who were in the background and they were sort of thinking to themselves, we've just got to keep our heads down and we've got to go with the flow here and we've got to find some way to make Trumpism work. Now they're coming out and they're saying, there's no way this project works, this project is crazy. And they're using words like crazy. And they're bearing their secrets. They're telling what's going on behind the scenes. And they're telling it to anyone who will listen. They're telling it to congressional investigators. They're telling it to lawyers. They're telling it to the FBI. They're telling it to journalists. They're telling it on Twitter to the broader public. But every hour, stories are coming out, not just about the dysfunctionality of this administration, but about the cruelty and about the fundamental irrationality. And we're seeing transcripts of phone calls that make no sense. And we're seeing webs of corruption being exposed. What's happening with Giuliani and his cohort, his accomplices. We're seeing this notion being put out there in public that Trump is basically running a protection racket from the White House.
Yeah.
A pay-to-play protection racket. Hey, you want us to protect you? Sure. Give us some money, give us some dirt. And it's becoming ever harder to defend him. You're not really seeing the Republican Party try to defend him anymore. They're trying to throw up noise and fog and distraction. They're trying to say the process is wrong. They're trying to say the impeachment inquiry is a witch hunt. But what they're not doing is saying, you know what? We think it's a really good idea to solicit the Ukraine and China in public to undermine elections. Nobody's saying that. Even Lindsey Graham's not saying that. You know, that's saying something. And as that happens, you see these really dramatic public opinion shifts. And the most obvious of those is the support numbers for impeachment. One poll after another, including Fox News, to Trump's incandescent fury, has shown now that a majority of Americans support not just the impeachment inquiry, but removing him from office. And this is why the unthinkable becomes thinkable. If Donald Trump is opposed by 50 or 51%, it's possible McConnell will be able to hold the line in the Senate. If Donald Trump is opposed by 60, 65, or 70%, which could happen as these allegations spiral, it is going to become increasingly difficult and increasingly politically counterproductive for McConnell to hold the line. Now, the thing is, Trump's not doing himself any favors here. Let's move on to Syria and to the Kurds. Because now what we're seeing is not just criminality. That's almost par for the course. We've gotten used to criminality with Trump. What we're seeing now is utter insanity dressed up as public policy. So, if any of you remember Leonid Brezhnev, the last long-term leader, there were a few short-term leaders, but the last sort of 20-year leader of the Soviet Union. Brezhnev was in power in the 60s, 70s, and I think into the very early 1980s. And for the last several years of his tenure, he had demented. We didn't know that at the time because there was this sort of shroud of secrecy around. But after the fact, when the histories of the late Soviet Union were written, a lot of his officials came forward and said he just wasn't there for the last few years. He wasn't mentally there. And they worked around. They had structures that allowed them to work around. And one of the things that happened was he basically withdrew from public view. And presumably a second thing that happened, though we don't know, is that his control over nuclear weapons was probably sort of handed over to the generals. Ronald Reagan, too, in his second term in office, we now know was suffering from dementia, from Alzheimer's. And the same thing sort of happened. The staff rallied round, they protected him, they moved policy away from him, and they tried to limit the danger and the destruction of having a president who wasn't all there in charge of nuclear weapons, national security, and everything else. And that's not happening with Donald Trump. So, let me go over a few things that have gone on just this past week, because these really are so extraordinary that I think they're worth... I do a column at the moment called Signal Noise for the Nation, where I try and separate out the stuff that's not important from the stuff that is important. And usually, I say, well, the tweets we should ignore. That's just noise. We should focus on the signal. In this instant, it seems to me the tweets and the public pronunciations are so extraordinary that they are the signal. Because what they're saying is, we are in a really perilous situation because we have a demagogue who is dementing. So, a few things. This week, the President of the United States, occupying the same exalted office that George Washington, Jefferson, Lincoln, FDR, JFK, Obama, etc., have all occupied in the past, has used his platform to preen to the world about his quote-unquote great and unmatched wisdom. Now that would be a stupid thing to say even if it really was a good policy. It's a really stupid thing to say when he's talking about his great and unmatched wisdom and then putting in place one of the worst foreign policy decisions in American history. In that same tweet, he talked about totally destroying the economy of Turkey. And this is not the first, I think it's the third or fourth time he's talked about totally destroying another country. He's talked about it with North Korea, he's talked about it with Iran, he's talked about it with Venezuela, he's now talking about it with Turkey. Totally destroying another country is probably not something any human being ought to be boasting about because it comes with a huge amount of human suffering. But Trump has no compunction about talking that way in public. Then, instead of totally destroying the Turkish economy, he basically green-lighted Turkey to go into the one part of Syria, this horrendous abattoir that's been this death zone for hundreds of thousands of people. The one part of Syria that was actually fairly functional and fairly democratic was the Kurdish enclave, which actually had democratic structures in place, actually protected women's rights, actually had some kind of semblance of political participation. And he green-lighted Erdogan to go in there and start a massacre. And then afterwards, he compounded the damage, I think it was yesterday or the day before, by saying he didn't care who went into Syria to help them. It could be the Russians, it could be the Iranians, or he said it could be Napoleon Bonaparte for all I care. This is extraordinary. This man green-lighted a massacre and then is saying, I don't care if somebody who's been dead for 200 years goes to help them, that's fine with me. He then gave a press conference with the Italian president, I believe, and talked about his quote-unquote strategic brilliance in a policy that, even as he was speaking, was leading to massacre, and that pretty much everybody across the political spectrum disagreed with. I mean, think of the feat he achieved, that he got Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Lindsey Graham to agree on anything. You know, this is completely amazing. It is politically brilliant in a way. I think, you know, you think it can't get worse. And then it does get worse. And I think the only way to understand it is that bullying and cruelty is now being superseded by bizarreness and crazy. And I've known a lot of people in my life who have begun dementing. And oftentimes what happens is they begin dementing and parts of their brain go first, and then they keep a muscle memory. I remember I saw a jazz musician a few years back, and she was in her late 80s, and she was really not there. You know, whenever she tried to talk, it didn't come out very well. But she still played the piano magnificently, because it was muscle memory. It was absolutely hardwired into her. And it seems to me that, unlike with Leonid Brezhnev or with Reagan as they began dementing, where they sort of faded slowly and quietly, unfortunately for us, Trump's muscle memory is demagoguery. And so the last thing to go is that ability to inflict pain, and that ability to gin up the mob, and that ability to create divisions between races or genders or classes. It's so hardwired into his personality, and it's so fundamental to who he is, that we're witnessing this completely catastrophic situation of the most powerful man on earth either dementing or having some kind of breakdown in full public view, and getting more loud and demagogic as he goes. And sending out these letters and these missives. They're quite simply extraordinary. I don't know if any of you saw the news today about this letter that he wrote a few days ago to Erdogan. And it was released, actually Fox Business was the first to report on it. I'm going to read you the whole thing because it is so utterly bizarre, and it is so impossible to imagine this comes with the presidential seal. Dear Mr. President, let's work out a good deal, exclamation point. You don't want to be responsible for slaughtering thousands of people, and I don't want to be responsible for destroying the Turkish economy. And I will. I've already given you a little sample with respect to Pastor Brunson. I've worked hard to solve some of your problems. Don't let the world down. You can make a great deal. History will look upon you favourably if you get this done the right and humane way. It will look upon you forever as the devil if good things don't happen. Don't be a tough guy. Don't be a fool, exclamation point. I will call you later. It makes no sense. And yet this is passing as official foreign policy in the year 2019 in the United States. Now, in most days, that would be far and away the biggest news story of the day. Because it's completely, excuse the French, but it's batshit crazy. I don't even think that made the top 5 today. Because in addition to that letter, you had the extraordinary spectacle of Trump basically throwing a temper tantrum at a meeting with the leaders in Congress from both political parties. You had him saying of his ex-defense secretary, a man who he desperately needs to stay silent, that he was the most overrated general, I think he said, in history, which is probably not the best way to get Mattis not to tell the dirty. And then he said of Lindsey Graham, who has been his most reliably craven toady for the last year and a half or two at least, went on this huge tirade about how awful Lindsey Graham was. Well, he's right, Lindsey Graham is awful. If you're trying to keep your political coalition intact and not get removed by the Senate, you probably don't want to tell Lindsey Graham that. And then, because it's still not over, I don't know if any of you have seen the news coverage of his statement that he made in the White House about why he was letting Syria and Russia have free reign in the Kurdish area. And it's the most bizarre thing, because he starts talking about Syria and he starts talking about Russia, and then he says, there's plenty of sand there for them to play in. And the stenographer looks up. And you have to watch this because the stenographer, this lady, looks up and she's like, and then she looks down and starts scribbling again and keeps talking about playing in the sand. And he does this for about 20 seconds. He just keeps repeating how they have to play in the sand together. Now, here's the thing. McConnell at the moment is still running interference in the Senate. And he's still saying we can have this trial, we can get him acquitted, I'll be the great savior of the Republican Party, it'll all be over by Christmas. But here's the problem. Daily, hourly, Trump is showing himself not just to be a man who should be impeached, but he's showing himself to as a man who should be removed under the 25th Amendment's provisions. And he's showing himself as a man who ought to be as far away from the nuclear football as any human being on earth. And I say this sort of slightly flippantly, but think of the moment we are in. That a man who any outside observer can see is losing his marbles has the power of life and death over every single person on this planet. The worst outcome of this whole thing would be if Donald Trump is impeached in the House and then McConnell arranges a completely fixed Senate hearing to guarantee his survival. Because at that point, Trump would have gone through every constitutional check and balance, and he would have shown the Congress to be utterly incapable of reining him in. And we know he has dictatorial instincts because he says so every day. The worst outcome would be if he feels empowered by a failed impeachment process. That's the terrifying thought. But I have to say, and I feel like ending on an optimistic note because, you know, what the hell. I've got to say, I think there is a growing possibility that Trump is going to prove so damaging and so delusional over the coming weeks that we're going to start seeing senators peeling away. Coming back to what I was saying about that cult of the personality, I really do think that when a cult of the personality starts to corrode, it does so very quickly. And I think it's entirely possible that all of those senators who have taken the insults and taken the humiliations and how to swallow their pride and how to look as their treasured policies on foreign policy and everything else were shredded, they're going to start not seeing the light, there's nothing moral about this, but they're going to start actually realizing just how destructive to the GOP's long-term survival prospects Trump now is. And they're going to start making a calculation. Yes, we have a primary base that is still largely loyal to Trump. That's the danger of going after him. But does Trump become so toxic that the second part of the calculation is, if we don't find a way to ditch him, we might get through the Republican primary, okay, but we are going to be so heavily punished by general election voters that it will destroy the GOP in the 2020 election. And that's where my optimism comes in, because it seems to me that unless Trump finds a way to shut up, unless somebody finds a way to disconnect his cell phone so he can't tweet in the middle of the night, he is incapable of reining himself in at this point. And half the time his words mean nothing, and half the time what they do mean is so terrifying that we wish they meant nothing. But I don't think Trump's going to come out of this intact. And I wouldn't be at all surprised if this unravels very quickly for them. And if at some point before the end of this year, Mitch McConnell finds a way to pull the plug on Donald Trump. That's the optimistic outlook. I don't know if I'm right or if I'm wrong, but it makes me sleep a little bit better at night. So I'm going to stop talking now. I'm going to open it up for questions, and I hope you have some questions to ask. I know you have one there. Yes.
Fantastic.
Thank you.
Well, let's say that, again, as I say this, let's say that Trump is still in office after the presidential primaries are over, and then there's one Democratic nominee for president. So I've seen that Trump is really good at finding a vulnerability and then going into it. So what would you counsel the Democratic nominee for president? What would you tell them on how to protect from this amazing talent that Trump has for worming into the whole thing.
Well, I'll be a bit careful about presuming to tell Democrats, what they should or shouldn't do, because, I'm sure they have a cadre of psychologists and everything else working with them on this. But in my opinion, very simple, go on the attack, because Trump thrives on weakness, and he thrives on people sort of stepping back a little bit. I would go on the attack, and I wouldn't stop once. I would just go after him and go after him and go after him, and I would absolutely refuse to let him take the initiative, because I think he thrives, as you said, in those sort of areas of weakness when a politician seems a little bit cautious or a little bit, moderate on an issue. I mean, I don't think Biden's a good candidate at all, but if Biden is the candidate, what he was saying, his catchphrase has been, I will beat him like a drum. And it's a cliche, but actually I think that's how you treat someone like Trump. You just go out there on stage, you're not going to get a proper debate with him, it's impossible. Go out there and beat him like a drum, and just make sure that everybody knows how sadistic he is, how irrational he is, how misogynistic he is, and so on. So that would be my advice, yeah.
So I saw in The Atlantic today there was an article about Trump's relationship with some of the military higher-ups in the Pentagon and how bad it was, which actually I was glad to read, because I guess my biggest nightmare is more that, so the good thing is that he would lose in the next election if he's still in office at that point, but then he refuses to leave.
That's my nightmare too.
Yeah.
Refuses to leave. So then he
That was
has
my
to be
nightmare.
removed, and probably he would need the
I mean,
army.
I've said actually to a lot of my friends on this when they've asked me this, that I have two criteria for who the Democratic nominee should be. And the first is who's going to present policies that I really, really like, rational, normal election kind of criteria. And the second criteria is who is already thinking about and has the stomach for that fight. Because I think you're absolutely right. Everything about Trump shows he's not going to leave power voluntarily. He's going to say there were, illegals voting. He's going to say that, there were irregularities. He's going to say that, whatever it is, he's going to make up one thing after another to find a way not to leave office, because he's fighting for personal survival. And this is the first time in presidential history where it's pretty clear that the minute he leaves office, he's going to be indicted. Even Nixon didn't face that. Mike Pence. Well, he was pardoned by Ford, but Mike Pence can pardon Trump, and the minute he leaves office, New York is going to indict him, and there's nothing Mike Pence can do about that. So he really is fighting for his personal survival and his fortune. And it's like Citizen Kane, where there's that incredibly dirty gubernatorial election. He will do anything and everything to not leave office. So yeah, my second criteria is which of the Democratic candidates has the strength to stand up to a man who is trying to stay in office after losing an election. I don't think Biden has that. I don't see anything about him to suggest he has that fight. But your question about the military, I've been reading a lot about this, and my reading, unless I'm sort of missing something, seems to be that the lower levels in the military have bought into Trumpism quite profoundly, but that the higher levels haven't. The generals, the officer corps does not like Trump and does not trust Trump. And I think, that's something that's going to play out over the next few months. It's probably already playing out. I can't imagine they're remotely happy about what's happening in Syria because their honour's at stake. And I don't like.
So could you, that could really devolve if he's the commander-in-chief, so who will the army follow, their commander-in-chief or their
It partly depends on how obviously irrational he's become, and this is why it seems to me that we should be having a conversation about the 25th Amendment. Not that any of his cabinet's likely to invoke it, they're not. I mean, I can't imagine, Mike Espers or Bill Barr or, any of these people actually standing up and saying, yes, our boss is insane. But it should be put into the public on a daily basis. We should be having this conversation that it's not normal to talk and act and send out tweets and letters of the kind that he's now sending out. And that when a man starts talking about sandpits, when he's talking about foreign policy, there's a thought process problem going on. That he's literally injecting random phrases into his speeches. And I think we should be having that conversation. I think psychologists should be out there, and geriatric specialists should be out there. There should be a conversation going on that deals with the mental health aspect as well as the criminal aspect. And I think that would give the military cover to, you know, what if he wakes up in the morning and says, I'm in a really bad mood, I'm going to order the firing of a nuclear weapon? There should be a military response saying, bad idea. You know, we're not going to do that. So that would be my answer to your question. I saw a hand somewhere there.
What about the 40% or more of people who have hung on to him, who have been indoctrinated by the right-wing pundits and radio, who really believe in deep state, who go along with him when he presents himself as someone who's beleaguered and unfairly treated, and who are fiercely opposed to Democrats, and I mean, so they don't have any allegiance to the Republican Congress. Republican Congress is afraid of them.
It's a huge problem. I'll say a few things on that. I think it's probably less than 40%. I think, you know, there's certainly 40% that instinctually will stay with him politically. I doubt that 40% of the country is as enmeshed in the sort of personality cult. You know, the ones who are very visible because they're the ones who wear the MAGA hats and they're the ones who go to these, you know, Nuremberg-style rallies and shout obscenities at immigrants. But those are tens of thousands, not tens of millions. You know, he has 65 million followers on Twitter, which is, you know, completely insane. But when he made that, you know, utterly bizarre tweet the other day about great and unmatched wisdom, I was following it, and within a few hours he had 148,000 likes. And I was completely stunned. I was like, you know, who are 148,000 people who read something that bizarre and click like on it? And then I thought about it more, and what that means is 64.8 million people who were following him actually took a break on that and didn't click like. And I think, you know, that's actually, you know...
The dog liked the tweet.
I think the hardcore is probably much smaller than the softcore. And I think that you're never going to get a you know, even in Russia today, there are diehards who still think Stalin was the greatest leader on earth. But the cult of the personality that meant that everybody in Russia supported him and that children wailed in their schools when he died, that's gone. And I think the same thing's happening here, that you're going to get a smaller and smaller hardcore. And I'm not saying they don't matter, they do, but I think it's going to more resemble a sort of European fascist party's support, where they get sort of 10 to 20% of the vote, but they can never form government.
But what about the issues they always bring up, which is he's anti-abortion, all of a sudden he is, and he's put the kind of judges we want in all over
and
the
that's
place,
McConnell's
you know?
calculation.
And so we're going to ignore all the rest of it because he's done these great two things that are our life and death.
No, and that's absolutely, you know, that is the McConnell calculation right there. I mean, McConnell must know what he's dealing with. McConnell, I don't like the man, but I don't think he's stupid. He must know how dangerous and delusional and cruel Trump is, but he's made a pact with him. He'll basically let Trump wallow in his own egoism in exchange for judges that suit the GOP base, in exchange for deregulation, and in exchange for tax cuts for businesses. That's the unholy bargain.
He'll get the same judges from Pence.
That's it. He would get the same. So, you know, at a certain point, it's a diminishing return because you do get the same judges with Pence. You might not get a viable electoral coalition for 2020, but, you know, for the next year anyway, you get the same judges. So, you know, at a certain point, McConnell's and other, you know, state GOP people at a certain point are going to say, we're not gaining enough from this unholy bargain to keep it going. And I think that's what's going to happen, yeah.
We got time for maybe one or two more.
Let's do two more.
Given the president's willingness to do anything to protect himself and the fact that he alluded to civil war just a couple weeks ago in his tweets, do you think that there is a possibility that this dementing individual could call upon his cult-like supporters to go out in the streets and start violence to protect him?
Absolutely. There's no doubt from his public pronouncements that he would do that. So then the question comes back to what you were saying, you know, where do the army and the other institutions of state fall on that? You know, he's going to have a hard time calling out his supporters in any state where there's a Democratic governor because the National Guard will be pulled up instantly. I suspect he's going to have a hard time calling out his supporters in many Republican states as well, because I don't think there's that many state governors who want to go down as being the people who sparked a second civil war. I don't know, I mean, you know, increasingly his presidency looks like a Confederate presidency. I don't know where the Old South would fall on that. I think you could get a situation where some of the more extremist Southern governors, you know, sided with Trump or even called out the National Guard to support Trump. I don't see how you get to a position where Trump wins militarily on the streets of the United States. I don't see that happening. But he's clearly hoping he can intimidate people into it. You had one question.
I did. So, you wrote a book called Jumping at Shadows, and it talks about like the irrational fears of people, and studies have shown that Republicans are Republicans because of their fear-based system. So they're not going to read your book or any books that actually help them or elucidate them. What can we do? Can you talk about some things that we can do as more rational people, I guess, to pull people in so that we don't have this, I mean, whatever happens after this, these are still people we have to live it with.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question, and that really is going to be, you know, as we try and unravel all of the damage of the last 4 years, this is going to be one of the great questions. How do we reestablish community? You know, some of it's media. You know, we have got to find a way, and it's not just America, but the world's political systems have got to find a way to make social media accountable. Because the damage that's being done by the echo chambers and the spreading of, I mean, fake news is a stupid term, the spreading of lies, the spreading of just out and out fabrications. And, you know, Mark Zuckerberg is so disgraceful in this. You know, this idea that they're going to operate as the world's, you know, essentially the world's largest media company, but with absolutely no editorial gatekeeping and no, you know, no ability to say, you know what, you can't run this ad because it's flat out false. So I think number one, you know, we have to find better systems of distributing information, because at the moment we've created really good systems for misinformation. The other thing is storytelling. And, you know, that sounds a bit wishy-washy, but you know, if you sit down in a room of Republicans and you actually present them one-on-one, as opposed to an abstract concept, but one-on-one with an undocumented asylum seeker who's, you know, left Guatemala because they were starving or the gangs were threatening to kill them, and those people tell their stories. Again, you're not going to convince everybody. You're just not, but you start breaking down that sort of refusal to listen. And I really do think a lot of it is, you know, a lot of it is doing that hard work of storytelling. And I think where I'll end it is, I did a story for The Nation, not a column, a reported piece, last summer, about a year and a quarter ago, in North Carolina. And it was a group called Down Home North Carolina, and they basically were in very conservative Appalachian mountain counties in the west of the state. And they were knocking on doors, and they said to me, look, we have to do this, because if we don't do it, the alt-right is knocking on those same doors with a racial vision. And so they were knocking on doors, and they were talking about community and solidarity, and how to expand access to healthcare, and how to expand access to opioid addiction treatments, and how to expand access to affordable housing. And they were creating these interracial coalitions. And they were doing it in 2 or 3 targeted counties, and they were impacting how people were voting. It was really interesting. There was just a measurable impact of that knocking on door and that speaking with people one-on-one. And I think, you know what, at the end of the day, that's how the civil rights movement worked. It's how people were canvassed for women's rights, for gay rights. None of this stuff happened by people just clicking on an emoji and saying like. It happened by legwork, by getting out into community. And I kind of believe that's where we're, you know, we want to heal from Donald Trump. We're going to have to knock on doors. We're going to have to talk to people in town squares and in meeting halls and churches and synagogues and mosques and everywhere else. And if we seed that ground, really bad actors come into the vacuum. That's where I'm going to end it. Thank you.
Sasha, before you go, we aren't seeing you in the Sacramento Bee anymore, but can you tell people where they might see more of your writing and, you know, where to look for you?
You're not seeing me in the Sacramento Bee because the new opinion editor decided they didn't want locals writing about national issues because no one was interested in it. That's the backstory. Where you can see me, I I'm now doing a subscription-based weekly column, the Abramskyreport.com. So just theabramskyreport.com. Or you can see me twice a week in The Nation. It's called the Signal Noise column. Or you can see me in Truth Out, where I'm writing sort of once a week on either Brexit or America. So madness on either side of the Atlantic. And that's it. All right.
Great,
Thank you.
thank you.
We have a few important announcements here. So if I could, Jill, you were right there. So does everybody remember our friends from NorCal Resist? They came and talked to us a little while ago about what we can do to help refugees and asylum seekers. Jill has some interesting news about NorCal Resist.
Yeah, and to use as a leaping off place the idea of building community as a way to heal. Those of you who are here to hear Autumn talk about what NorCal Resist has been doing since November of 2016, with respect in particular to helping immigrants and asylum seekers in Sacramento and at the border. It is really built into a growing network of folks who are providing all manner of services for immigrants and asylum seekers here, including rides to their ICE appointments, their doctor's appointments, assistance with donations, getting kids vaccinated and enrolled in schools, donations, furniture, supporting people with their legal fees and legal needs, absolutely every aspect of a person's life when they're here and dependent on the sustenance of community. And so Indivisible is happy to support those efforts, and in one of the ways that NorCal raises money for it is their annual Pozole dinner in December. We're going to be posting about it on Facebook and in the newsletter. I can attest to the excellence of the pozole itself, chicken, vegetarian, beef, I believe, all different kinds of very festive, warm evening. You can buy tickets, there'll be links. You can just donate to the event, but we want Indivisible Sacramento to support it with a sponsorship, to raise enough money to do that. So we will be glad to accept direct donations, check or cash or however you want to do it, to Indivisible, which will go directly to sponsoring these ongoing efforts. So thank you guys.
So two more announcements here. Peru has one.
It's not actually me, but I'm going to make it really quick. What can we do about the impeachment? Vanessa's going to talk about a really cool tool that Indivisible has, and I think it's called the Impeachment Up Dialer, which you can just use from your own computer at home. You can go home, open the computer.
Oh, yeah. If you want to help impeachment move along, Lindsey Graham, today, Mr. McConnell said he will do his job, and he made a big announcement about how he's gonna do his job and he's gonna hold an impeachment. If the House moves forward with impeachment, he's gonna actually hold an impeachment trial in the Senate as is his job to do. So thanks for doing your job, Mitch. And Lindsey Graham is organizing to get Republicans to sign a letter saying no matter what happens during the impeachment trial, they will not vote to impeach Donald Trump, which is obstruction and also possibly jury tampering. I don't know. But in any event, you can call vulnerable senators that might be in districts that are malleable because they haven't come out for or against it, and they have a really big election coming up. So Indivisible, if you go to indivisible.org, and there's a big tab about what you can do on the Senate on the very first page on the slider, and you just click on it. You can call from home. You sign up for a shift. We're calling 5 different Republicans in mostly red states, and you are connected with another constituent to talk about impeachment, and they would be connected during that call to their senator's office to ask their senator to vote to impeach Donald Trump. Yes.
And the link to this is on our website.
Beautiful. See, you guys are amazing.
I can say it every
Yeah.
time.
Just either last weekend or the weekend before, there was a march in favor of impeachment that took place across the country, but there wasn't one that took place here in Sacramento, from what I can tell. Is there any discussion about getting one of those going for our local community?
What are you doing for the next couple of months? You wanna?
I'm running for Congress.
Okay. All right.
I used to organize those, but now that I have a full-time job, it's hard.
I can do it. I'll do it.
You wanna do it?
I'm happy to give you all the resources to organize that.
Danessa will help you. She will help
Let's
you.
get it done.
Yes.
So if you've ever been frustrated that you can't call elected officials who don't represent you, and that's one of Indivisible's strongest beliefs. If you've ever been frustrated that you can't just call Mitch McConnell directly and tell him to do something, this is a way around that. You call constituents in their states, and they will call their senators and tell
So
them.
the constituents that you're calling, are they Democrats?
I believe so. I think the lists are, they pick people on the list who are going to be favorable to us because we don't want to call Republicans and get them saying so. And then, sorry to make you wait, Doug, but
the best for the last.
that's right. So we've done, if you recall, especially earlier in the year, we were talking a lot about the legislation that's going on at the state level before the impeachment news kind of took over everything. We were really working hard to get some great laws passed at the state level, and Doug has an update on that.
If everybody got one of these, it's just a recap of some of the pieces of legislation that we decided at the beginning of the year to support with your input, and also from the other 64 indivisible groups within the state. So just real quickly going some of these wins that we had this year. AB 392, which was the big focus this year, was to change the way law enforcement can engage with deadly force from reasonable to necessary. Unfortunately, with that law got watered down so much, there is no enforcement mechanism in that law. So it was a small step, but an important step. Some of the other important pieces of legislation that passed this year, AB 32, and for-profit prisons. Skipping down a little bit to SB 136, which added 1 year for every felony. So if I was convicted of a second felony, they would add an additional year to the sentence.
Overturned that, right?
Yeah, so it was a law to remove that.
Yeah,
there was an automatic extra year on the sentence.
Right,
that was
and that
really
repealed that. Right. SB 27, which was the Presidential Tax Transparency Act, which Trump immediately went to court on. That also applies to the governorship, however, also.
And that one has some sentimental. Sorry to interrupt you.
No.
The first year that we existed, we were around for 2 weeks before we saw that there was a bill in the legislature to require presidential candidates to release their tax returns, and we thought, this is cool. We should try to help get this passed.
Right.
And it passed the legislature in 2017, but the governor vetoed it because Jerry Brown was just weird like that. But this year it actually passed. So the first thing that we ever really tried to work on here, it finally got done.
It got done, it went to court, and the first federal court rejected the law. So it's now, California is now appealing it. The governor vetoed SB 139. This was to fight county gerrymandering. The governor actually vetoed it based on budgetary reasons because it is a mandate from the state, and the state has to reimburse the counties for doing this. And it was not included in any budget for the coming year. So that was his reason for the veto. It is still back in the Senate, however, for a possible override. 2-year bills that we're looking at next year. SB 50 from our good friend Scott Wiener, who's addressed this a couple of times in the last couple of years. Requires denser new housing around transit centers. Although there was a lot of controversy around this bill because a lot of groups felt that it would drive or destroy some neighborhoods and allow gentrification in those neighborhoods. AB 4 expands Medicaid to undocumented immigrants, requires voting centers. AB 363 requires voting centers in all counties to be open Saturday, Sunday, and Monday before an election. ACA, a constitutional amendment, restores voting rights to people that are on parole. And there's some additional ones on the back. AB 1332 prohibits localities from entering into new contracts or investing, or working with ICE or CPP. So that's about it. You can take a look at the rest of them, and I think early next year, probably the end of January, early February, we'll be reaching out to everyone to see what legislation is important, that you feel is important. I just want to add thank you for all of you that attended hearings, made calls, wrote letters. It's important. So thank you.
Thank you, Doug, and thank you everybody who came out today. I think it was a great meeting. Have a good month. And we'll see you on the postcard parties.
Yes.